What are the biggest mistakes you can make in planning your doctoral project? Stick around and find out the Big Five today on Navigating Academia. What's up, everybody? My name is Dr. Phoenix Singh, and I want to welcome you to today's episode of Navigating Academia, your leading source for career guidance on how to be able to advance in academia. As always, I appreciate the love, so please do like and share this video with your colleagues and students, subscribe to our channel, hit that bell, and comment below. You can follow us at the social media accounts right here. So, today we're going to be discussing the 5 biggest mistakes in planning your doctoral project that's going to be used as the basis for your dissertation. Why make your life more difficult than it has to be, right? Graduate school is already hard enough, right? So let's go ahead and jump right in. Mistake number 1 is assuming that you need to change the world. I can tell you from personal experience, this happened to me. I remember when I first got into my doctoral program, this was the case where I thought that this research that I was doing for my doctorate needed to be my seminal work. This needed to be something where I was not only proving to myself that I could be an academic, but I was proving to literally the whole field, my family, my friends, I perceived it to be the world, that I was this, like incredible intellectual or some nonsense like that. But at the age, I got started when I was still 21 in graduate school, my first year. So it was something where that kind of made sense for the age, but it's also a huge mistake because at the end of the day, this should not be the most important research that you ever do. This should be research that is something that, yes, you're passionate about, but where the methodology that you're using if you're in a science or the background research that you need to do if you're in something like, let's say, English Lit or in art history, is something that you can get done without having to go to the ends of the earth to be able to do it. And we'll be talking more about some of those ends of the earth situations in future mistakes here that we'll cover in a moment. At the end of the day, the focus here genuinely should be to get the degree, get the title, and learn a lot of skills and make a lot of mistakes. Because what I want you to remember is this saying: I want you to fail bigger, fail faster, and fail better. That's my goal for you, okay? And if you can do that, you will find yourself being so much more successful than people who have, paralysis by analysis. They're just going to be sitting around thinking about all the mistakes that they're going to make, being terrified of making those mistakes, thinking it's going to ruin their life, and ironically not doing anything because they're so perfectionistic. And of all people, I am a type A. Trust me on that. So I understand the fear of making mistakes on things that we perceive to be very, very important to us and especially important to our careers. But it's something where you can't let that hold you back, especially when it comes to doing your master's or doctoral degree, and especially in just getting started. I had several occasions, 4 or 5 times, I conducted front-to-end research studies and essentially had to just completely throw them out. Worked my butt off to be able to get these things done and ended up, literally on the cutting room floor. Not because I didn't find things, to be interesting, etc., but simply because it didn't make sense in the context of my dissertation. And this brings us to number 2, which essentially is to make sure that your different studies or your different chapters within your dissertation fit together smoothly. This was the reason why I ended up publishing a lot of these projects later on down the line. So when I say on the cutting room floor, I didn't end up throwing them away forever. But it was the case where I ended up having to really adjust my focus, and my doctorate ended up taking longer than I suppose it otherwise would have because my different studies did not flow from one to the next. Each one of your studies should be focused on a central theme, and it should make perfect sense to a reader who knows nothing about your specific topic area. Should make perfect sense to them why, after you did the first study, you would move into the second, into the third, however many studies you have. And if it's only one big study, again, in terms of analyses, you shouldn't have analyses that are just coming totally out of left field, covering hypotheses completely unrelated to everything that you're doing in that scientific research. This is something, again, that I learned the hard way. At the end of the day, I have 2 doctoral dissertations. Both of them have these different topic areas that are flowing into one another study to study. To tell you about my Oxford doctorate, I started by doing something called a meta-review, which is a systematic review of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And the way that I did that was that, I started with this universe of reviews that I identified via systematic search. I narrowed it down. I did a variety of different analyses to be able to identify trends and patterns, and I ended up finding that there was a real need for a new meta-analysis. And if you don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's like when you take a lot of primary studies, individual studies, and quantitatively synthesize them to get kind of big findings based on all the previous studies in the field on a specific topic with a specific population, specific outcome, whatever it is. You're going to get bigger level findings. That's a meta-analysis. So the second study that I did was a big new meta-analysis that sought, if nothing else, to be able to fix those issues that I found in the meta-review. And the third piece was, having done the meta-analysis, we ended up with a lot of really unique findings, which suggested that there was a need for the development of kind of a simple screening process for violence risk. Because remember, forensic mental health, forensic psychiatry was my first doctorate at Oxford. So what happened was that I developed a simple screening tool as my third study. So as you can see, the findings of the first study led into the second, led into the third. And this, guys, is really the keys to the kingdom. Because if it's not, what's going to happen is that your reviewers, they are going to ask you to justify why you did a study that maybe came out of nowhere, or again, if you're not doing scientific research, but instead are doing, a really focused doctorate on literature, art history, etc., it's going to be something where your reviewers are going to ask you a lot of questions about your chapters. And if your only justification is to say, well, this seemed like an interesting area and it's in, the same general field, so I did it, that's not an adequate justification, right? So remember, your studies or your chapters need to make a cohesive and cogent story. Mistake number 3, again, has to do if you're in a field where your doctoral dissertation involves scientific research, especially something that has to do with medicine, behavioral health, etc. Really anything where you could use a prospective longitudinal study design. And this essentially means that I have a cohort of individuals and I am following them up into the future. And the reason why this is an issue is really 2 things. Number 1 is attrition. In other words, people falling out of the study. So let's say that you start with 100 people in your cohort, you start following them up, and then you've got to, censor a whole bunch of those people, meaning screen them out, because they didn't stay around long enough in your follow-up to be able to do the analyses you want to do. This could literally mean that maybe you even had funding for this study, or you worked your butt off to get ethics board approval. Oh my gosh, your whole dissertation has to be scrapped essentially, unless you can find some really clever ways to be able to get around it. For example, using things like, Fisher's Z, if you know what that is. So essentially to be able to do basically correlational analysis on very small, samples. It's one of these things where that can be really hard. And the second thing is, I have had colleagues whose longitudinal studies literally follow people up for, let's say, a year. And then because of attrition, they got to start a new cohort and it takes another year. I've got colleagues who are still doing their doctorate. I finished my first doctorate a decade ago. This is something, guys, where it just really can make your life really difficult. And I'm not saying don't do it. In some cases, it's really necessary. But if it's a situation where, let's say your supervisor, for example, is quite insistent that you use a design like this, you should really think about having a serious conversation with them about, your goals and their goals, because at the end of the day, your reputation and theirs are really tied together, and you want to make sure that you're making them look good. This is critical in terms of being a graduate student. So again, keep in mind that prospective longitudinal study designs could be a little bit risky. Mistake number 4, especially if you're doing scientific research that needs institutional review board approval, is choosing a topic that'll make that kind of approval very difficult to get. Again, this happened to me, and hindsight is 20/20. I always say that people giving advice, to be honest with you, most of the time, it's just a form of nostalgia. So I ask that you be patient with me if this is something that, you haven't run into. So IRB approval, essentially, and they'll call this different things in different countries. I'm specifically talking about the US right now because, this is, essentially where I was born and raised, even though my doctorates are from the UK and Germany, where they have, similar ethics boards. They call them specifically ethics boards in the UK. It's very important to understand that there are unique populations that it's very difficult to get review board approval for. For example, working with youth, working with anybody under the age of adulthood, legal adulthood, can be very difficult, especially if you add additional things. So I'm saying I'm working with youth, but I'm working with young offenders. Or I'm working with individuals who have been diagnosed with a major mental illness or an intellectual disability. Oh my goodness, it can be really hard to get review board approval. To give you an example of something that I've run into here in the States, when trying to do research studies with children and adolescents who are currently in a juvenile detention center, their lawyers get involved. So the facility may say, yes, you can do assessments here and you can use that data and publish it. They're actually very pro research most of the time. They usually don't have somebody on staff doing that research, and they believe it can drive evidence-based practices and improve things like lower rates of recidivism, meaning reoffense, improve the quality of life of individuals who are in those institutions, etc. The thing is that if parents have to sign off, when you're dealing with children and adolescents. And most of the time, the parents think to themselves, well, let me ask their lawyer, and their lawyer will say, oh my goodness, just don't have them participate in anything, because if whatever the findings are, it ends up making the child or adolescent look bad in some way. So for example, one of the studies that I wanted to conduct was taking a look at callous unemotional traits, which some people would say is like, a predecessor to psychopathy, being a psychopath in adulthood. They're like, what if this researcher inadvertently, doesn't expect it, but he ends up finding that, little Billy ends up being callous unemotional based on his assessments. This can look really bad, if this ends up, going into, being subpoenaed and ends up going into a courtroom. So this is really something that people take a look at. So it can make getting ethics approval really hard. So you really need to keep this in mind. And if possible, if you're going to develop a proposal that's with a sensitive group, be comprehensive, but for the love of God, be fast. You want to get failed really quickly. You want to get rejected by the ethics board as fast as possible so you can move on with your doctorate. You don't want some, lengthy 6 to 8 month ethics process. I spent at least half a year getting rejected the first time, especially because I had to get approved from Her Majesty's Prison Service, all sorts of places, which were very unique because of the population I was trying to work with before I finally settled on my end doctoral project. And be ready to pivot. Right, pivoting is not a bad thing. What you went to grad school to do in terms of a research project, that may not be what you end up having as your finished product, as your finished dissertation topic. And don't be upset by that. Be flexible and go with the flow. Otherwise, it can be really frustrating. And finally, mistake number 5 is doing whatever your supervisor tells you without really understanding or being able to explain why you're doing it. A really key piece of graduate school is learning to learn and really deeply understanding and becoming an expert in your area. At Oxford, this was certainly the case, and it was something where when I started grad school, I was still in that undergrad mindset of my supervisor is going to tell me what to do, and I'm going to do it, and I'm just going to trust that, whatever the individual says is right, and I'm not going to really, pick beneath the surface to figure out why, especially in areas where I was not only not an expert, but I initially found challenging. Like, I love stats now, but statistical analysis was something where that was a real challenge for me, especially, complex multivariate stats. And I really had to become an expert on that as part of my doctorate. Otherwise, I essentially wouldn't have survived. I needed to justify exactly why I was doing everything. Every methodological decision, regardless of whether my supervisor gave me input or I made the decision myself, I had to be able to explain why I did that and why I did not do other things. If you can only say, well, I used this analysis because it made sense that, the data was there, If I was your reviewer for a doctorate, what I'm gonna tell you is, okay, that's fine, but, did you consider X? Or what other statistical analyses did you consider and you didn't use, and why did you not use them, etc. I expect you to be able to justify that. Your reviewers and your supervisor are the gatekeeper for you getting that title and being considered a doctor and becoming, a colleague, especially, down the line when you end up getting more established. You want to hopefully build relationships where you can be working with those gatekeepers as well, because they're going to know you well, you're going to know them well, and just like a parent raising you, they're probably going to rub off on you in terms of a lot of your, thinking process and all will be similar to theirs. That can make it even easier to be able to work with them in the future. So I highly recommend spending the time and understanding everything about your topic, regardless of whether you're in a field of scientific research or whether you're writing a dissertation, again, where you're doing a lot of research, but you don't have to worry about things like, p-values and this kind of stuff, or null hypothesis statistical testing. Know what you're doing, know those decisions, and regardless of who tells you or who gives you feedback and suggestions, you need to understand everything more than anybody else. Alright, y'all, thank you so much for watching. It's always great to have you here with me. I want to hear from you in the comments below. How is your master's thesis or doctoral dissertation coming along? And if you could go back in time, would you have planned it differently? I want to hear from you, whether you're about to go into grad school, you're in it, or afterwards. We're all a community, and it's great to be able to share your stories and give your guidance, because we can always learn from each other. Don't forget to like and share this video with your colleagues and students, subscribe, and follow us on social media. If you're interested in getting one-on-one career mentoring in academia, send a free consultation call with me via the website below, and let's see if there's any ways that I can help you to be able to get to the top of your field. I'm signing off, everybody. Have a great day, and remember to get out there, take chances, and be your best self. Thank you so much for stopping by, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here as always. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more in this series on navigating academia, please click on one of these links over here to be able to view more original content. I hope to see you there.